to Too Real a Talk, a journalistic discovery through critical movements for change. Once again, my name is Kelsey Jean-Baptiste. I just want to extend a thank you to those who watched the first episode on IGTV, Facebook, Twitter, on LinkedIn, and on my website. But before we get into the second episode, just a disclaimer. Any views or opinions represented or expressed here do not necessarily reflect the position of Too Real a Talk. Any content provided by guests are of their opinions and are not intended to malign any religion, ethnic group, club, organization, company, or individual. Now let's get into the second episode. I wanted to focus on systemic racism, so I started this new segment called Too Real a Talk on the Street, where I do some real on-the-ground reporting. This past Tuesday was the primary elections, and I wanted to focus on how voting relates to systemic racism. Here, let's take a look. I'm here at the polling station in downtown Brooklyn today, asking voters, how does voting relate to systemic racism? Here's what they had to say.
Well, if you don't vote, you get marginalized, obviously, but to me, voting is the last step of the process. So your candidates are already selected for you, so you gotta get involved in the process way before voting. Voting is the last step. You have to form political action committees. You actually have to run candidates to ensure that they're running for the things that you want. Because if you don't, you just voting for somebody else's agenda.
And why did you come here to vote today?
Because even though I feel that way, still gotta vote.
First of all, I think if we want to do anything to dismantle systemic racism, it is so embedded and endemic in our society that it's going to take time. But I think the first thing and the most powerful thing we can do is vote. Because if we're learning anything right now, it is who is in Congress and who is president matters very much. And those people have to be motivated to do something about creating a more equal and just society. So I think we can all go out and protest, we can post things, we can talk about things as much as we want to, but if we don't show up to vote, it's really all just shouting into the wind.
I would like to thank those who I interviewed on the street. The Too Real a Talk on the Street segment is an opportunity to do some real on-the-ground reporting, making sure that people's voices are being heard. At the end of this video, I'm going to post some links and articles to some of the research that I found on voting and systemic racism. Many Black Americans are being disenfranchised from voting right now due to past felony charges, and I think it's important that we educate ourselves. But let's get into the second segment. I had an opportunity to sit down and interview with Dr. Jasmine Harris, assistant professor in sociology at Ursinus College. She and I spoke about systemic racism. Let's take a look.
I think that this is a really great place to start because how the cultures that people grow up in, the institutions that they interact with over their lives, teach them to think about people of different races, right? And, this happens through a process we call in sociology socialization. And when I teach intro, I always say to my students, this process is perfect, right? And it's perfect because you don't have any sort of conscious awareness that it is happening to you. So if you are a white person who has lived and interacted in the United States for, more than a year, you have in some ways been not just privy to the privileges that come with being a racial identity that is atop the social hierarchy, but you are also being taught as a process of this socialization how to think about others so precisely but subconsciously that it becomes a part of your way of thinking. Right. And so, something that discussion that is happening around the Rayshard Brooks murder and that, came up with Eric Garner and Michael Brown is this idea that well, you're resisting arrest, right? And that is what is causing this escalation. But we see white people resist arrest all the time and still manage to be taken into custody unharmed. The difference is that all of us, and I should say this, right, that the socialization process around race is not something that people of color, Black people, or Latinx people are exempt from. Dismantling racism is something that's going to take another 500 years. We are so close to, historically, to Jim Crow. We're so close to the emancipation. We have more years under slavery and Jim Crow than we do outside of them.
Dr. Harris, being from Minneapolis, believes that one of the biggest issues with systemic racism is police presence.
The reason that George Floyd is being accused of, I think in some cases I've heard it was a counterfeit bill. In other cases I've heard that it was maybe a bad check. But in either one of those cases, you can't tell right off, that those two things might be true. And so an escalation of calling the police immediately is rooted in that sort of racialized residential segregation in the area. And that's true of all cities, right? One of the things that I make my students do when we get into race, especially because I teach mostly white students, and to get them to understand this, is I say, raise your hand if you have committed a crime this semester. And a reminder, crimes are underage drinking, smoking marijuana, there's like all kinds of things. Right. And, they slowly start to raise their hands. And then I say, raise your hand if you were afraid in those moments that you were breaking the law, that you would be arrested or at least approached and accosted by the police. And most of their hands start to go down. Now, juxtapose that with an area of a city that is predominantly Black or predominantly Latinx. Mm-hmm. What you're going to get is more police patrolling, more cop presence, because of this perception that that's where the violence comes from, right? And so when you hear people talk about, well, Black people are only 13% of the population, but they're 70% of arrests and things like that, it's like that's not indicative of some biological predisposition towards deviance or violence or anger. That's because we are being over policed, because we are being surveilled in a way that others are not. And I know a fairly young police officer, he's like in his 40s, that I'm friends with, and he said that we are not taught to de-escalate. We're taught to shoot. They're telling us not to get in hand-to-hand combat with people. And so if that's the training that you're getting, and you've been socialized to think of Black people as inherently violent, scary. I remember the man who murdered Mike Brown said in his deposition that he was afraid for his life because Mike Brown is this, big, tall man. That man was 6'5" himself, the police officer, right? So you are a 6'5" white man, husky, with a gun. You're basically the same size as this man that you are trying to arrest. But you are so afraid for your life. And I'm not suggesting that he's lying, but that fear is something that has been socialized into him.
Surveillance takes on the form of different interactions with the police. Dr. Harris talks about in an encounter her partner faced with cops in the Pennsylvania area.
My partner is a Black man, and just last week, he's an essential worker, so he has to work, and he works second shift, so he doesn't get off until midnight. And a police officer followed him basically all the way home. And it wasn't until he pulled into his apartment and it was like clear that, and he got out and he was like, I just looked at the police officer, like, what am I doing besides going home from my job to my house?
Dr. Harris speaks about addressing and affecting changes in systematic racism at the higher education level.
What I think is a better way to move forward is to acknowledge that because racism is systemic, that means that it has infected all of the institutions that we engage with on a daily basis. Mm-hmm. And if we want to talk about, I think it's harder to talk about dismantling racism in the individual context, right? So like people's beliefs. And it's probably better to think about it as, okay, how does systemic racism work in higher education, for example? How do we, in the same way that we're talking about the police, right? How do we reimagine higher education such that it starts to chip away at some of the legacy of systemic racism? There's a problem with higher education generally, in that you shouldn't be able to be a bio major, for example, without having to take a course that talks about race and, you know, debunking the connections between race and genetics, and, you know, creating a discussion about the sort of finite nature of genetics and biological testing and the social construction of race and how those things are created. You just shouldn't be able to. You shouldn't. And what ends up happening is that when you bring those things up, then the administration and the other faculties say, well, teach me, right? Teach me then. You know, do a word. I can tell you how many Teaching and Learning Institute workshops I have led for faculty on this campus about issues of race in the classroom, issues of race in pedagogy, issues of race in writing. And one, it's always like the same 20 faculty that show up to those things that probably don't need the education, right? It's the other people who we need to be there. And two, like, I have other things going on, right? Like, why does it always have to be the Black faculty who are on the diversity committee? We've lost a couple of people since then in terms of Black faculty. So we're down to like 8, 7 maybe. Wow. We have lives outside of this. Like, it can't be our responsibility to teach the faculty and the students and the staff and the administrators how to deal with this stuff. And so some of this has to be the institutions putting more resources into recruiting, retaining Black faculty, into incorporating different voices into the classes. So an easy thing that people can do that is talked about often, but people never do it, is what we call decolonizing the syllabus, right? Which is like having faculty look at their syllabi. Is it all white men? Probably, that you're having your students read. Get rid of some of them white men and put in some other voices. There are Black women, there are Latinx women, there are Asian women, there are Indigenous women doing amazing work right now that is just not getting to the forefront of these discussions because we're not white men. And so what happens on these campuses that are, you know, institutionally racist is they bring in a handful of people, and then it becomes our responsibility to not just inform, you know, and educate, but then also we're trying to protect, you know, and advocate for the Black and students of color that are on campus that we're trying to shield from some of this stuff. And so it has to be a more concerted effort. It can't be, well, we hired a couple of Black faculty this year, that should be good. It has to be, every student has to be required to engage with issues of race. Mm-hmm. Every faculty member has to be asked to have different racial identities represented in their syllabi. Like, it's not acceptable anymore. And I know that the older white faculty do not want to hear this, right? But it's not acceptable for you to just be like, well, you know, this is year 17 and I'm 60 and this is the way that I've been teaching and I don't know this stuff, so I can't be required to do the work. It's like, I'm sorry, then you either need to retire or you need to sign up for an online course so that you can get up to speed on this stuff. It's just not acceptable anymore.
I would just like to thank Dr. Jasmine Harris once again for doing that interview. This concludes the second episode of Too Real to Talk. I would just want to say, get out there, like, support, share, and also comment. I want people to tell me who you think I should be interviewing, places that you think I should be doing on the ground reporting, and more topics that you want to hear about. This platform is for everyone. I want to share it with my community. So let me know. Stay tuned for the next episode. Bye.